This episode, I'm joined once again by Mauricio Loza to discuss magic, advertising, and his new documentary, Eros Unchained. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running indefinitely, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Mauricio Loza, thanks very much for joining us once again on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you, James, for having me.
We're going to be discussing a documentary which has been released in Spanish.
Yes.
Called Eros Unchained, but it does have English subtitles. And I was given a VIP access to watch the whole thing for free. So thanks very much. And this is a documentary, really, the two other conversations we've had about your own book and then about Ion Culiano's book, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. This is a documentary really following that, and it's described as a documentary about the influence of magic on advertising and the media. So we're back in this realm of magic beneath advertising, media and desire, and ideas around this, all really beginning with a very secure foundation from Renaissance magic with figures such as Giordano Bruno. But yeah, I guess before we jump in with these big ideas, just tell us about how this documentary came about. And, I know it's currently in Spanish and available in Spanish. Where is it available? And also it's going to be English audio soon as well, right?
Yes, we think so. We're still working that, but yeah, it should be in English.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, so you were asking me how was it that it
how did it came to be?
Okay. All right. So that was kind of a fortunate coincidence because I published The Hounds of Actaeon, the book, one of the books the documentary is based in June 2020, in the middle of the worst of the pandemic. And I uploaded the introduction to academia.edu to let people know that it was out. And in September of that year, I received a message from Gabriel Garcia, who is a Spanish designer and director who had read the introduction. And he was very interested in reading the whole book because he wanted to make a small documentary, something like 20 minutes long, for his YouTube channel, which is called Culto TV. And it turns out that he had been reading Ion Culiano and many of the other authors I had read while researching for the book. And so after reading the book, The Hounds of Actaeon, he told me that we should collaborate writing the script for the documentary. So being a designer myself and having seen his work, which is just amazing, and knowing how difficult it is to someone will ever want to translate your book into an audiovisual format, we started working. And after some 3 or 4 months, I think, of writing, we had some 3 hours worth of material. And so we were thinking, should we make a feature film or a series? And after some deliberation, we decided to go with the series. First, because we really liked the material we had, and we didn't want to, cut it down to half an hour to an hour and a half or something like that, and, risk washing it down. So we went with the series, which draws mostly from archive and stock images, and also features some great animations and montage by Gabriel. So that's how it came to be.
Mm-hmm. And obviously I said that the documentary is of what the series is about, the influence of magic and on advertising in the media. I mean, how would you describe the trajectory of the series?
Well, it is that we wanted to give a full account of how erotic magic influenced not only advertising, but also public relations. But to do that, we needed to actually tell the story from the beginning. So the first 2 chapters are actually kind of were made to explain the magical context in which advertising can be conceptualized as magic. And then from the 3rd chapter onwards, we see the history of how magic transforms into some other disciplines, right? During the 17th and 18th centuries, and then it comes to be psychoanalysis. It touches psychoanalysis and becomes advertising, and then it influences the whole thing. So that was kind of the trajectory of the whole series.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And would you say, I guess you mentioned there erotic magic, would you say that's the pretty much, I guess there's a few questions there, but what's the difference between normal magic and erotic magic? And why does it have to be, does it have to be erotic magic for advertising?
Well, we could say that all sorts of magic are erotic in a sense. They are if they resort to desire. But the sort of magic that advertising draws on historically is erotic. And the reason is because, advertising is really based on manipulating erotic or manipulating desires. It doesn't have to be erotic in a strict sense, like sexual, right? But they do have to incite people and they have to cultivate desire. And to do that, well, unconsciously, they resorted to using some magical techniques that were developed back in the Renaissance, right? They were refined in the Renaissance because they had been developed, in a long time, in the last 2,000 years or even more. So that is why I think we should say that it's erotic magic that influenced advertising and PR.
So I guess maybe later on we'll touch on that sort of the libido force of when it moves from magic to psychoanalysis. But you mentioned 2,000 years. I mean, where do you trace these back to? Do you have, is it I guess I'm assuming 2,000 years ago it gets fairly vague. I mean, do you see a strict starting point where what becomes Renaissance magic begins?
Well, I would say that it probably starts with Empedocles. His idea of this is kind of funny because his idea of the four elements branches off into magic and into science, right? So we have both materialist science fork from that and also magic. But I would say that Empedocles is like the natural starting point for that. And at that time, what we now call philosophers, such as Empedocles or Heraclitus or all those guys, they were actually more akin to what we will call a magician or a shaman, actually. So yeah, I think that's kind of the logical starting point.
Do you think philosophers these days are still touching on magic, probably without realizing it? Philosophers in general. So I mean, looking back, a lot of them would have been priests, shamans, as you say, or their equivalent of priests. One of the things that comes across in this work and in your work in general is that we're entering into a time as you move from like strictly, I guess we now call that philosophy, but as you just said, Empedocles and Heraclitus, it's like philosophy, magic. The context is so different that it's a whole different thing. Then you move into more strictly magic with like Bruno, and then you move into psychoanalysis, and it's like almost with people like Edward Bernays, you move into an era where it's like you're doing magic but you don't realize it. So it's almost like my question would be, how many people in these academic fields might very well be casting something out, doing some magic without really noticing it?
Well, I think most of us do in a sense, and as if we manipulating desire, we are doing magic. In the sense of philosophers, what happened is this, and this also applies to science, is that when a society moved along the centuries, as it developed, we tend to think that this societal process overcomes certain phases, right? And we might think that we have overcome magic and religion, but we never actually overcome. It's kind of what happens with a person. You never overcome things. You actually either use them or you repress them. That's kind of the idea. So what happened is that our society, our civilization, repressed magic and religion, and there are many layers of repressed magic. Right. And we resort to those constantly, but we do it in other terms so that we never know that we're actually doing it, but we are doing it. And many, even some strains of materialist thought are thinking magically or are resorting to some immaterial essence in the end because they can't quite figure out how to do it materially. Right. So this happens everywhere, I think. But we are not, we're not that able to accept it, I think, because we are used to telling ourselves this story in which we have overcome these modes of interaction.
So these sort of magical repressions, you see them definitely coming through, but do you think we've masked them in such a sense that the institutions and our habits of the way we do things, our religions are magical, but we've created a sort of hegemony or language hegemony, which consistently denies it, but they really are. They follow all the same structures and forms.
Well, I wouldn't say everything is a religion or either magic, but I would say that there are many things that we are not used to thinking about magic that it is. For example, one of the most outstanding of those things could be Marxism. For example, Marxism, and I'm sure Marxists will not agree with me, and they will be like really taken aback by the idea, but being materialists themselves. But I think that, for example, Marxism could be conceptualized as a Gnostic religion, right? You can think about the proletariat as the elect, right? And they have this special knowledge. They have this knowledge that is called dialectic materialism that will reveal the true nature of history, right? And because they have this knowledge, they know how things are going to go, and they know what they have to do to have things go their way, right? So it's kind of a religious idea, but it's it's masked in this rationalist and materialist way of seeing things.
From all your research, do you think human beings generally need that, and without it, we get a bit lost?
Well,
that structure in general, not Marxism.
Yeah, well, I think that, well, it's not that we need it. I think in a current situation, we do need it. I mean, as civilized beings, but this type of civilization, responds to a very not limited, to a very specific set of circumstances that is started back in the Neolithic. So, having that into consideration, I think that in this sense, we do need religion. But I think if we think in terms of nomadic cultures, they are not religious in the same sense we are. They are more magical, but not religious. So, they would structure things differently, I think.
Well, I guess drawing in the series, one key element, and we've drawn on this in our other talks, there probably will be some overlap, of course, but the soul really is the central element, and even just the symbol of the soul. And it seems, in asking that question about whether or not we need the structure, it's all these symbols, which maybe like Jung would say they're, down in the collective unconscious, like they're there whether you like it or not. They're here, the soul is still here. What do you think really, it's a peculiar question actually, what do you think happens to the soul when we sort of try and find a way to deny it in the way we have in the modern world? Do you think that it ends up a bit, I don't know, I guess a bit drawn off in the wrong direction? You lose control of the soul, really?
Yes, you do. I think, well, as with anything you repress, it eventually gets out of control. It will lose its moorings, and it will start doing things it's not supposed to do, which is actually what Jung thought that was happening during the First World War. The German psyche had been repressed for so long that it was reacting in these ways, right? So I do think that the soul responds in that sense. But, the soul is a really kind of abstract construct for us to think of, especially being modern human beings. So we can think in these terms, but what is exactly the soul? So that, that complicates the whole issue, I think. But still, I do think that if we repress, anything we repress, it will come back, in full force, trying to let us know that we shouldn't be doing this, and that, there is a different way of doing things and of being.
So on a societal level, in terms of repressing magic at the moment, or this general magical repression or religious repression or spiritual repression, No,
go ahead.
I was simply going to ask, how do you see that? How do you see that coming back full force in the, I guess, in the near future?
Yeah, probably. But what I think is that we have manipulated magic, secular magic or advertising magic, let's call it, in such a way that we might be going to be impacted really bad from doing all the spells. And I think we're going to go into that later on. But yes, I think we will see consequences from our way of relating to magic and a way of repressing magic and using it for other ends.
You mentioned spells there. Could you give an example of a secular spell? A common secular spell?
Well, advertising is a spell. That was, well, I studied graphic design. I think I told you this. And, well, I was always trying to understand what I was actually doing when designing a piece of design, right? When, when advertising, whatever. I was always trying to pin down what was it that I was doing and why did it work beyond, certain visual parameters. And this can only be explained in magical terms, right? You can only explain this, as kind of suggestions that transcend the material and get in touch with something deep inside the person and affect the person, right? That is magic, right? I mean, if you use it as a symbol, for example, logo, right? You are using kind of a sigil, right? That's kind of the idea. That's the way I saw it originally. And then I started developing the idea that advertising was magic in that sense.
So there's a certain form of deconstruction. I mean, there's a certain point there of if I put the right words or even just images on this piece of paper and put it in front of someone's face, something is happening in them as an individual apprehending this random collection, well, not random, but collection of images I've put here, and that there is something that is then caused in the symbolic realm in a peculiar way, which causes them to go, I need this thing, or I want to do that thing, or I now believe this thing, or I now desire this thing. I think about this a lot. I think about, there's this task, there's this exercise, and I can't remember in what spiritual book it's in, but it's like you look around your room and you look at each thing, and then you try to trace it back to the fact that there was a point where the desire for that random object began. Because at a certain point, most of the things that I look around my room, I go, I never knew I needed them, right? At some point. So something had to happen to cause. Do you consider the thing that's caused a lack, like an anxiety? Or is it more of a positive thing that it's like, it's not necessarily a lack, it's more like the person wants to do something?
Well, I think in the case of advertising, most of the time is a lack because most of the things we own, apart from the essentials, we don't need. We don't actually need. We need really little to live. But we are, we were born and we grew in the society, which is constantly instilling desire to get us to consume more. So I think and it's not actually a true lack. It's not something you actually lack, but it's something that you are made to be lacking, right? Until you really believe it and you start buying thinking, okay, I really need this. I have to have this. But most of the things we have, I think we don't actually need. We just buying them because, hey, either someone else we admire has it or we need it, to for appearances, for show. So that might be the reason why it works so well. But it's, I think, a manipulation essentially.
Do you think on a magical level the lack is ever fulfilled, or do you think that this form of magic is always trying to keep the door open?
It keeps the door open, but I think the main thing to keep in mind here is that capitalism and essentially capitalist desire is infinite. I mean, when the economy was based on need, right? Needs are easily satisfiable and are limited, but desire, you can desire whatever. They can make you desire whatever, and you'll keep desiring more if they manipulate you correctly. So as we switched from an economy of need to an economy of desire, we went into this dynamic where we'll always will be desiring more and more and more, right? So it's never ending, I think.
Do you think we're getting to the point where we desire?
Meta desire. Yeah. Well, maybe. Well, I don't think we need capitalism to desire that. But yes, we could be desiring for desiring itself, for desire itself. Yeah.
So in the sense that you consider it manipulation, is there something, for something to be manipulated, it almost presupposes that there was something which was itself before and was doing perfectly fine. So in the sense that advertising manipulates us, what is this thing that we have that's, maybe some philosophers would say authentic or like the real self or the essence? What's this thing that's getting manipulated?
Manipulated.
Yeah.
Well, in magical terms, I would say it's the pneuma, right? The soul or the spirit. But I do think there is a psychological unity that is slowly destroyed as we grow up and begin an education. And this, the features in this destroyed unity is what manipulators and magicians and operators use to get in and insert desires and whatnot. I think that's kind of the way it works. Well, the way I imagine it to work.
Are our five senses the obviously they're the primary route, but is there other routes in?
Well, there could be, in the terms of erotic magic, in strict terms, they go through the senses. Magical spells go through the senses, but there are many other ways to manipulate that magically, right? Mm. You can do it without the other person knowing or ever seeing or hearing anything about you. But it's not the case of erotic magic, right?
It's funny now I think about it, though, in terms of the five senses and how powerful advertising is and how much advertisers want the money, right? Which seems to be the strange end goal of all this manipulation, that actually they limit themselves pretty much to two senses to sell things, sight and sound. Yeah. Do you see a future where adverts might be some things we feel? I mean, so for instance, the reason that seems peculiar to me is it's fairly commonly known that like you smell something, that's the most powerful sense in terms of nostalgia, memory, feeling. Do you think that could be the next step for advertisers is to start?
I think they're actually doing that already. I think they're selling. Yes, I read this a couple of months ago. I think they were using pheromones to sell fragrances, right? So they're trying to manipulate you in a very basic level. They're trying to go to your actually hormonal desire to make you want something. So I think they can use other senses to get into that. It's more difficult to go into touch and smell, but I still think they may be going in that direction. Yes.
Doesn't surprise me, but I guess one thing that's almost I find somewhat pessimistic, not about your work, but about the underlying thing is like throughout all of time, so many people have tried, especially psychologists in the modern era, from Freud onwards, have tried to so Freud was very focused, of course, on the sexual nature of things, and originally had the libido, then that moves through to the Oedipal complex, but it usually has this basis in the father and the mother, and this it's quite a sexual psychology in a way. I don't know if you'd agree with that. But then you move through to Jung, and he's sort of saying, well, it's not as sexual as you're making it out to be. We move into this realm of myth and archetypes. And then like Adler moves through to more character analysis and much more modern types of psychology seem to be a lot more Adlerian. And then Reich, he stays with the libido. But the thing I find so pessimistic is that human nature just hasn't really budged an inch in these 2,000 years. It's still this seemingly extremely modern phenomena of advertising, of images on a modern screen, is jumping right back to the most primitive desire of mating, of sexual tension, and it doesn't. It's. Do you do you find that pessimistic? Do you find that sort of, I don't know, in a way, yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say it's pessimistic. I think it's the way human beings operate. In a sense, we're animals, and being animals, we respond to very particular interests and instincts, right? So if someone learns to manipulate your instincts, they will get a long way doing that, I think. So I don't think it's pessimistic. I think it's realistic, actually, because, it's not that we never advance. We do advance in a sense. But we are, in this context, in this civilization, we are tied to certain parameters that may not be that easy to let go of. So I think that's actually what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So before the advent of advertising, of course, in Bruno's day, there probably would have been forms of advertising in Giordano Bruno's day, but it wouldn't have been as prolific as it is now, not even close. But prior to that, in terms of this long history of what's going on here, I mean, where did this magic find its place in the world before it was used primarily for manipulation? Was it used perhaps in a more holistic, wholesome sense?
Yes. Well, for Renaissance magicians, for people really dedicated, devoted to magic, it was a way of life. But magic had many applications in daily life. Casting spells was a valued work in any village. They had the magician, had the witch, people that were specialized in doing, and in getting you what you wanted. You can get, that person that won't pay attention to you. You can get them to pay attention to you, to fall in love with you, for a price. So there was an application. There has always been a practical application of magic because it's always about manipulation, but it was never this generalized and it was never this systemic in the sense that it permeated the whole economic system and it became the core of it, right?
I like that idea of in the Renaissance you go to this magician, obviously this is a bit rough and ready, but you go to this magician, you want someone to fall in love with you, pay the price, and that seems very primitive, that seems almost quite manipulative on the surface, coercive in a way, but actually it's one of those, it's a very clear example of how we haven't changed all that much, because here's an advert for, sex appeal fragrance or the latest fashion to make yourself, more attractive. Yeah, more attractive. And so in that sense, these things become basically sigils for you see that, you go buy the thing, that lack is fulfilled. In that sense, you are unknowingly casting some sort of manifestation of your future. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I think it's I think the way you pictured it is a very hands-on approach. I like it, but you isolated it. It's a lot more complicated. So it's not your idea seems to be that it's not only us who are being manipulated, but we are also manipulating. We are also casting. When we use that fragrance that makes you more attractive, we are also casting a spell. So that makes things a lot more complicated, I think. But that is a really good way of seeing it, because it is actually what happens. And, we humans are always manipulating from the cradle. We are, we always want to get what we want. That's human nature. The thing is how we go about and do it. And if we harm people or if we don't, or if we set up this oppressive system to keep everyone buying, right? But I think, manipulation either institutionalized or in a person is kind of a part of human nature of needing or being in the world.
It makes me think of a book by Michel Serres, which is actually just on the shelf there, which is why I saw it and I thought the same thing. So he wrote this book, The Parasite, which is basically about the idea, sort of like, in a way, it has a lot of similarities with the word of manipulation, where we have inherently this understanding of the word manipulation and the word parasite as bad things, right? Parasites are these things you don't want in you. But Serres puts forward the philosophy of, like the cow is a parasite on the grass, and then the grass is like the gut is then a parasite on the grass, and then, the cow craps on the grass, but then the crap is now a parasite on the grass, but the grass actually needs that. So everything it's just parasites all the way down. So it's like, that, and in a sense you're talking about manipulation as well. If you think about manipulation in like the etymological sense of just the basic meaning of it, it's just changing something to fit your own preference of it. So, but the problem then, I guess, arises, if you're in agreement with what I put forward there, the problem arises when someone basically starts to draw out a box and finds a bit more power than everyone else and begins to manipulate the whole world to their vision. And this is sort of Bruno's theory as well, right? That the people who have the power to truly manipulate a lot of people, these need to be virtuous, good people. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to make sure that they are the equivalent of sort of a priestly class.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the problem arises when, as you said, a group of people find the way to manipulate people, to rid them of something, right? To rob them of something, which is their will. You're doing that constantly in your daily life. You try to get things. You try to get people to do things for you, right? That is normal. But if you do that to rob them of their will and make them do your bidding, then we are going into we're getting into an ethical problem, right? And this is what happened. What went out of control with advertising is that you deny people their will because you are constantly bombarding them with images and slogans and logos that make them think that they really need this when they don't. That's, I think, the problem with it.
So it's put forward by quite a lot of thinkers that the will is really like the will and attention. So the will actually is attention is a function of the will, and like in a way, the more attentive you are, the more, quite literally just attentive of where you're being pulled, where you're being drawn, is a function of the will. And in that sense, advertising is very clear. They're just constantly, as long as they've got your attention, you don't really have that chance to take a look, take the third position and say, hang on, and they do it in very malicious ways, of course, in terms of the illusion of choice is one of the worst ones, in terms of like, you think we've made you think you're free by having the eco brand of whatever it is. Now, it's probably going to be quite a peculiar question, but this is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. And it comes up in thinkers such as Gurdjieff and Steiner. And I'm not sure if you'd have read their work on this, but it's the idea that eventually the will can be ground down to such an extent that you're no longer really left with a human being. You've got this sort of machine. Gurdjieff would say a machine. Steiner actually says that eventually technology, and we can include advertising in there in terms of the progress of advertising technology, will eventually sort of grind down humans to become these sort of just automatons who are drifting around. I mean, in your research in this Renaissance style of magic with this soul in the central place, do you think it could ever be that humans are ground down to become puppets?
Yeah, well, I think, it depends on you, ask. I think it was Gurdjieff or Spensky who said that we were actually asleep. I don't remember which of the two said that. So in a sense, if we are asleep, we're not in control. We are kind of a puppet, right? But I mean, you could characterize the situation as that. So for some people, I mean, the more radical you are, you will understand that as that. I don't think we are there yet. We are very close to becoming automatons in the sense that, as you said, attention and will are connected. And the more scattered we are, right, the more automatic-like we become. Right. So and everything in commercial culture is set to induce this state in which you are completely scattered. I think Stephen Talbot, an American writer, he calls it the scattered self. And, when everything is set up so you can never be centered, when there is a myriad of stimuli tugging and pulling at you constantly, there is no way that you can find out what you want and who you really are. That is really complicated. So we take the short route, which is like, okay, we decide we are this, we go this way, and we try to maintain our integrity. I think that's what actually happens.
So one really great thing of your documentary, just to draw on this notion of attention, of will, of regaining something, is it's pretty optimistic. Like, you're trying to keep it optimistic in the sense of drawing in, how can there still be this radical freedom in the face of this manipulation? And so how can there be this? How can we still have freedom in the face of all of this?
Well, I wouldn't say radical freedom. It's what we can do is we can take responsibility of ourselves. I think, if you are scattered, what you can do is you can center yourself, is you can actually pay attention to what you're doing. And they call this mindfulness these days, I think. It's a self-help technique. They use it also for corporate development and whatnot. But it's actually just paying attention to what you do. There's this short by Gus Van Sant. It's based on a short story by William Burroughs. It's called Do Easy. And the only thing that Burroughs said, does is pay attention to what he's actually doing. That's the way of centering himself. So this is kind of Zen dishwashing. You just pay attention, complete attention to what you're doing, and that way you return to yourself. But I think this kind of technique is what you have to do to center yourself in a world in which you'll be constantly menaced, threatened by stimuli that won't get you anywhere. I think this is the kind of responsibility you have to take.
And if you don't focus on that, whereabouts are you?
everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I think you become scattered, and you become liable. You become kind of a victim. You become prey for a myriad of spells coming from anywhere. So I do think it's important. I mean, it's not like you dissolve. It's not like you're ground down, as you say it, but you lose unity, right? You lose your individuality while you think you are retaining your individuality because you are consuming this or that brand, which is, an incredible trick. If you do this or you do that, you'll be like this and people will perceive you like this. But actually, there won't be anything like behind you, within you, just that illusion that you project at everyone else, right? It's really masterful in that sense.
So you've been hypnotized, but you've also hypnotized. There's an idea, because hypnosis and somnambulism come up in your documentary, and there's an idea that all hypnotists will tell you is all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. Like, you sort of have to believe it, but at the same time, if the advertising, if the magic is potent enough, it's almost out of your control to not believe it, because it's you've been embroiled in this culture of advertising as it is. So the irony is, it's like you're being hypnotized, you're hypnotizing yourself, but because you also believe it, other people also believe it. And it's almost like a culture where you want to get a pin, and the whole thing would begin to fall apart if one piece of belief stopped. And it makes everything seem very fragile. Do you think in a certain way, to try attend to this freedom, it's almost like if we all attended to it all at once, it would be too much. We need to retain some of the structure, even if it is manipulative, because to remove it all at once, so many people would be left with nothing.
Well, I never thought about it like that. Sure, it could happen in that sense. Well, in that way you're describing, but that's why I don't think we haven't had such a rough and massive awakening. I mean, even people who know what is going on, or who know or actually think that this is the way it's going on, we can actually say that this is the way it is. But we can't do much about it. We can write a book, we can make a documentary, we can be mindful of our habits, but beyond that, it's really difficult to really liberate yourself, right? Let alone massively to from this kind of thing. So I think it's really difficult to get out of that situation. It's really difficult to break the spell, because we are too invested. Our whole lives are invested in it. So I think that's kind of the problem, why people won't go away from this scheme. It offers them too much. It offers them a life, a living, right? If you realize and you act accordingly, you lose your whole self, or what you think is yourself, at least, even if it isn't.
Do you think everyone has the possibility to wake up, to free themselves?
Yeah, I would like to think so. I don't know if everyone does. I mean, being optimistic, I would like to think that most people do have the potential to do it. And I think, the main thing that's keeping us back is fear, probably. It's fear of losing ourselves, because we don't know ourselves in any different way. It's like fear of change, really. This is massive change, but any change produces fear. So this would produce massive fear.
It's interesting. Something I'm reading about Wilhelm Reich actually at the moment. I know I told you I was going to bring him in. He actually says that the one of the things he would always emphasize to his patients in terms of change, because his change was happening on a level that was in spite of them. So instead of working primarily with the talking cure, and there was this conscious level of things at least happening and trying to understand the past, the bodily, with the bodily functions, retaining this unconscious tensions, and then doing certain exercises, and most of it happened while you slept, in spite of you. He would say the ultimate element was courage, because if you're changing as a character, what he called character analysis. If you're changing on your character level, on a very real level, you're going to experience a lot, because, well, quite literally, you're changing. So there has to be this odd courage. Now, this brings me to, I guess, a sort of a contrarian point is, what role do you think, as you do see these connections between Renaissance magic, psychoanalysis, character studies, the way people's selves and egos, what role do you see modern therapy playing? Do you think it's bolstering the magic?
Well, it depends on what kind of therapy you're thinking of it. And if you're thinking of like corporate seminars for productivity, yes, it is fostering the magic. But I think there are still legitimate forms of therapy, Reiki and Gestalt being two of those. Well, I haven't studied, but well, in a sense, what has happened is that the establishment, the magical establishment, let's call it that way, has co-opted this forms of, we can conceptualize therapy as magic, right? Because it operates on the images of the soul and whatnot, right? So what they're doing is they are co-opting these forms of magic to bolster their own performance. So yes, it is happening, but still think that you can do that. There are forms of therapy that are not meant to give those results.
See, this is the most malicious thing I see, I think, in terms of this sort of self-created labyrinth of, if you put it very simply, you have someone who perhaps at some point realizes life isn't all that great. They want to do something. They want to exit. Like Gurdjieff says, you need to realize you're in a prison before you can escape. Then they realize they're in a prison. And I think the most malicious thing is when that's all been co-opted and even multiple exits have been made by magicians as well. What we might call magicians. And so you end up trapped in a multi-exit labyrinth where everything is already created for you. And I think capitalism does this perfectly, right? So if you don't like normal culture, well, it's there's the alternative culture, and then there's the even more alternative culture and fringe culture, right? But they all end up sort of flat.
Yes, totally. And I think, for some people, the moment when they realize about this comes about either with a crisis or with disease. If you're really ill, if you begin to feel the impact of these things in your body, of your living, of the way of living in your body, you'll realize you are in trouble and you will want to do something and you'll start searching. So maybe disease in this sense is a blessing and start and will put you on your way to realizing and doing things about your life, trying to get out of the whole scheme.
You mean a literal disease?
Yep. Yeah, it could be. I mean, imagine how hard it can be to, get cancer or whatever, right? I mean, how scared can you be? This could be enough to hold you out of your paralysis and get you moving and get you doing things to make your life better. Well, I've seen it happen a couple of times. It doesn't always happen. But, a good life crisis can do that as well.
Do you think have you seen more people fall back because they can't deal with it? They need the comfort. Yeah. Well, I think it happens every day. Even, I think that's a normal experience. We're constantly, I try to do this mindfulness experiments all day, but I can keep that the whole day. I need to think while I'm doing things, so you constantly sleep and fall and get up, is that kind of relationship, I think. Mm-hmm. So alongside, being mindful, what else do you suggest? Because I know, as I said, you really are trying to push this idea that maybe not to go search it out yourself, or that there is going to be this, as I said, radical freedom, not radical freedom, but there is still the possibility of pulling back the veil. So you just keep attentive.
Yes, keep attentive and keep non-scattered. Keep yourself unified in the sense that try to, know these are my parameters. This is the way. It's kind of like drawing the line, right? These things I go for, this I won't go for. You have to draw a line and you have to keep at it to not let in all that, the barrage of stimuli and all the spells in. That's kind of the thing you should do.
So to ask you a really big question, big philosophical question, in the sense that we've been manipulated, and in the sense that our desires aren't really our own, and in the sense that then you begin to pull back this veil or look towards something more real, what does that real thing look like? Is the real really just the method you approach things? You know, am I being sincere with myself? Am I actually being honest? Or do you think there's something more?
Well, I wouldn't have an idea because I've never seen it. That's kind of the thing. Is like you have this aspiration of making things better because you feel they're not that good. But knowing what's going to happen, knowing where you're heading. I mean, I get the sense that I'm going somewhere good, right? It has to be better, but I don't know what it actually looks like. So it depends on what author you base yourself. For example, if you take Reich, we were talking about him a while ago, this kind of unity would look like, how could I put it? Would look like something, like you've been integrated with your body, and this would bring you health. Right? You'd be healthy and you would be integrated psychologically and bodily. So that I think it's kind of a really rational aspiration.
You think we're disconnected? Capitalism and this form of magic also makes us disconnected from our bodies?
Yeah, totally. I think so. Well, whatever makes you more, whatever decenters you will disconnect you from your body in one or another sense. Yeah.
Well, I haven't really touched on too many of the bigger themes of the documentary. I mean, is there anything about the documentary specifically that you wanted to add in that's maybe a bit different from our other two talks?
Well, there is a feature of capitalist magic, of media magic, that I would like to stress on, and it's its capacity to actually create demiurgic bubbles of reality, right? Different realities. And we see this everywhere these days. Any magic spell can do that at a person-wide level. But if you take like what's happening in with the war in Ukraine right now, you can see a gigantic demiurgic bubble develop in Russia, right? So millions of people right now in Russia are convinced, because of the Russian state media, that there is no war going on in Ukraine. It's a special military operation, right? Well, this is getting increasingly difficult to sustain. But, Putin's idea is to get people to believe that version of reality, or what they call now the narrative, right? So they live in a different reality from the West, right? And not to say that we are right and we were selling our version of reality, right? But when we have two realities confronted, there is no way to reconcile, right? There's no way to reconcile. I mean, there isn't even a way to understand each other, and that I think is really dangerous. I think it actually classifies as an existential risk, because a war could break out, a bigger war could even break out, and there will be no way to stop it because there is no way to relate at a basic level. We won't have any common reality, right, to negotiate. So in that sense, I think that capacity, that capitalist capacity, is really, really dangerous.
You think that's why wars break out generally, is because ultimately it's two realities which just have made themselves incompatible with each other?
In a sense, yes. But the example I just gave with Ukraine, I think is really a sign of the times, right? The way how we can manipulate and create independent realities, and even like continent-wide realities. That is really scary. There's always a misunderstanding, but there used to be common ground, right? I mean, both parties used to be grounded and agree on the same things. Nowadays, I think, well, more often than not, things will tend to slip into we don't have any common ground, right? So confrontations will be total.
And I would assume that individuals are within multiple demiurgic bubbles of these sorts.
Sure. I mean, take, for example, they didn't call it a demiurgic bubble, but a filter bubble, right? Yeah. In a social network, right? You only see, they feed back to you the things you have already seen. So you only see this kind of material, right? And this is actually how Trump won the elections in 2016. He manipulated this this really tiny filter bubbles, right, to his advantage. And he managed it. I mean, he was able to sway the vote in swing states, and he actually did it.
What happens when those bubbles burst?
Well, either they build themselves up again in the sense that people just won't realize what happened and they'll just get to it again, or people realize it and try to do something. But the result of that option is not guaranteed. I mean, anything goes. Maybe you realize, but can you act? That's the thing. Can you act on it? That is really, really difficult, I think.
And we don't tend to like vacuums. So it might be as one bubble bursts, you find yourself quickly drawn to
another.
Whatever the next safest place is to be. You find this in the left-right distinction, right? Well, you're either this or that, and there's no,
Totally. Mm-hmm. Well, take, for example, what you mentioned made me think of QAnon. And as this had to begin as a tiny bubble, right? You know, a small group of people that were into this idea. And then it just blew up to incredible proportions. So there you have another instance of a modern phenomenon that is actually kind of like a religion, right? You get, and it's actually Gnostic as well. You get blind belief. You get a figure-like person, which curiously enough is Trump. You get Q, that is actually disseminating the message, like a gnosis with his messages, right? And when you have all this together, you have it's like seeing new religion being born and develop in front of our eyes. It's really amazing in a sense. But this starts from a tiny bubble. I mean, someone thought it was a good idea. And I think a disaffected person thought, hey, this guy's right. I think that's the way. I think that's what's going on. So I'll go with it. And he says that to next person, and just grows from that. So it can get really, out of control.
What do you think the future holds for this kind of magic?
Well, I'm not optimistic about that. I think that it, first of all, I don't think that capitalism will ever stop on its own, right? So given that we are on a finite planet with finite resources, if we keep on stimulating desire, right, indiscriminately, what will happen is I think this is what's going to go on. I may be wrong, but we are going to bring on an econo cataclysm, right? It will be both ways. It would be probably start ecologically, and then it will feed back into the economy. And when these things go together, you have an apocalypse, right? You have the common down of civilization. So, this is my doomer mentality going. But I do think that in that sense, capitalist spells will take care of themselves, right? It's kind of like that. It cannot accelerate eternally. And if it does, I would be surprised that it can be kept at that level continually. So I think that's the reason it will probably collapse. So maybe it's not in our hands, right? We just have to keep on doing what we're doing, just need to keep on consuming, and it will eventually break.
Maybe. I think so. The only way it has out of it is some sort of space interstellar resource acquisition. If we stay on this, but that's not looking likely. If we stay on this planet, then I'm pretty much in agreement with you. But that's not going to be pretty. Magic. So magic will eventually eat itself. Well, this kind of magic will eventually eat itself.
Yeah, and eat the whole system with it.
And then probably we'll all start again anyway.
Well, we'll have to, I think. Well, whoever is left.
So, it's a bit of a bleak ending, but whereabouts can we find your documentary?
Okay, it's in Vimeo. We put it there. It's we put a price of €10 for it. So it's 6 chapters and some 3 hours worth of material there. So I think people will enjoy it if they are interested in magic and advertising. Yeah.
Well, I'll be sure to put the links in the description below. And are you working on any more magic and advertising material, or?
We are working with Gabriel in a new documentary, but it doesn't have to do with magic per se. It's more of a story that talks about hyperstition for one, simulation theory also, and it's trying to weave a story around those concepts. That's what we're working on right now.
Sounds very interesting. Can't wait to watch it. But yeah, it seems like a good place to finish up. Mauricio Loza, once again, thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, James.